Yeah, this is I don't know what I was gonna say.
It's punk.
Playing Nirvana.
The Cobain 50.
Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums.
Nirvana.
From listener-powered KEXP.
This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry, welcoming you to our fourth roundtable in this series. This month, we're dissecting the very idea of punk, what it means, and how some of the recent albums we've covered on the series recontextualize the genre and the bigger idea of punk.
I feel as though punk is a religion, and everybody has different interpretations of that religion.
Yes.
And joining us for this religious conversation are our friends, colleagues, and collaborators, Janice Headley.
Hey, everyone.
And Albina Cabrera.
Hi, chicos. ¿Qué tal?
Always such a joy when we can all get together after working on these pieces like in isolation. We're talking about Shonen Knife's Burning Farm, which Janice and Martin did an excellent episode on that. Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks. Shaggs' Philosophy of the World, and Black Flag's My War, which was helmed by our boss, Larry Mizell Jr.
This is a great collection of albums. I feel like every time we do one of these roundtables, I'm like, oh, this was such a great collection.
Yeah, so I mean, let's start with like a really big existential question that I feel like is going to like coat the conversation. What is punk? Like, what is punk to you all?
Oh, who wants to start? Should I start?
Of course I should start.
I jumped
Reverend Martin Douglas will start in his sermon.
Jumped in talking and in order to ask everybody who wants to start. Here we go. That is a huge question to me. I always go back to Kurt's idea of punk, which is punk rock is freedom. I don't think there's a straight ideological aspect where you can just boil down punk into one sentence or one frame of reference. It's wide ranging at this point. There's so many different ways to do punk, but it all comes back to the idea of freedom, of expressing yourself in a way that doesn't involve outside factors like capitalism or religious, like standard religious dogma, because I've been talking about how punk is a religion itself. And just the idea that if you have an idea, a frame of reference, a way you want to change your environment, whether that's, the outside world or your interior, you can do it. You can do it however you want. And that's what I feel punk is.
That's great. And I think that when you were mentioning about punk is a religion, I think that to me, the first word that I can think about is the community. It was the tool to build my community when all these external factors maybe were against me or against the things that I want about life and about love, music, my country, the culture, and everything. And that made me think about something that Alice Bag said about what was punk for her. And she was like, I found my home. I found my refugio in a moment where I was feeling very alone. And we're talking about Alice Bag, like a Chicana from the US, from LA. And I'm talking from my personal perspective, being from someone from Argentina, South America, like very far away. And it's amazing to see like how we all feel this connection around punk that is beyond music. Mm-hmm. It's more about the community and the things that we found there that maybe we couldn't find it in our current situations, worlds, and cultures.
Absolutely. Like between the two of you, I'm like, wow, I don't even know more to add. Like, I think I agree. I mean, to me, it's funny to think about punk. A lot of these like genres or names, they get put on to people or music. Like the Sex Pistols didn't call themselves punk; other people did, But the embracement of that idea, because like punk is supposed to be derogative, like, oh, you punk, like get off my lawn or whatever. But that embracement of like defiance of freedom, it resonates deeply with me. Certainly in the music, it's an attitude, it's a way about moving about life, and Yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to hear more of our thoughts because it's to me, punk changes on the circumstances and the situation.
Yeah, I was going to say something sort of similar, Dusty, that I think for me, I see punk as sort of like an attitude, like not necessarily like, an aesthetic of like, loud guitars and yelling vocals, even though that describes a lot of the music that you'll hear on KEXP's punk show, Sonic Reducer. I think that punk can also be applied to lots of like different art forms like music or fashion or art, or even like, different genres of music like folk or, I think for me, like punk is about like defying convention and the idea that like you have to like, play music a certain way or sing a certain way or look a certain way. I feel like, punk is sort of like defying what is expected. And yeah, I guess it's that freedom to kind of like just do your own thing, even if it's not what society deems acceptable. It's interesting, like the Shonen Knife album, I think is a little different, I guess, aesthetically from the other albums that we're discussing today, in that it's, they're singing about cute animals, but it's still, to me, like that's still really punk, especially for Shonen Knife, because, not only were they three young women in a very male-dominated genre of punk, but also in a very male-dominated society of Japan. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they defied all of that and did it without compromising who they are, like that to me is very punk.
Yeah, I totally agree. It speaks to me when you talk about how Shonen Knife are still punk, but their song topics are like cute and fun.
Yeah.
And like punk doesn't have to be sneering at the establishment or sneering at anything, really. Punk can be this warm-hearted embrace of the things that you love. And I think Shonen Knife exemplifies that perfectly.
Yeah, and I think that comes to an idea of like punk as community too. And I want to clarify too, because I know that like punk is meant to be, I think at its core, open and accepting, and it's a space for people who feel outside to feel like they belong. And that's not always the case with punk scenes. Certainly, like there's been, read any book about punk and you find gatekeepers and
exclusionary tactics.
Yeah, exactly. But at its best, like some like best community I found have been like in punk houses and basement shows, where at least when I grew up, there was a great punk scene in my hometown, in a town that was very like conservative and suffocating, and I felt like there were people who thought like me, and find literally underground like people who shared the same ideas, same taste in music, and were, despite the music often being aggressive, there was a loving spirit about it, like literally embracing each other.
It's good also to see like how the idea that we have about punk evolves during the time, because what I found punk, I don't know, 13 years old. I was starting to be a teenager, and to me it was very important, the aesthetic. It was very important to be against something, because to me, punk, it was the only tool that I have to learn more about the political situation in my culture across Latin America. And it was punk, the movement that spoke loud about that thing. But if we're talking about Shonen Knife or also the Shaggs, I think that I found this band because I was reading these top 50 albums that Kurt Cobain wrote. And right now that we are doing this podcast, I'm starting to understand a little bit better the context and the situation. And I think that I'm feeling more punk than maybe like decades ago, I am understanding something that maybe when I was a teenager, it was more about aesthetics and about being against something. And now I'm feeling that it's more about an attitude and a way to see life and a way to feel emotions as well.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And your sense of finding punk is very similar to mine, in that when I was young, it felt like it was all about an aesthetic. It felt like it was, the kids that wore leather jackets to school and had spiked hair and smoked cigarettes in the parking lot and always got in trouble because of all of those things. And then you grow up and you realize that punk is a community that, is largely founded on social justice. I mean, I've discovered personally a lot of different social justice movements because of my involvement in my local, also the internet punk scene. My discovery of punk rock feminism, or, what people call Riot Girl, was the basis of me finding my place in the world as a Black man and learning about all of the things that Black people had to go through from a social justice standpoint.
Totally. And I was about to say that. To me, punk, it was my first introduction to what feminismo means. And I learned so much through punk, I think, about economics, politics, everything through punk. And that is something amazing to me.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think a lot about, we talk about like Nirvana and Kurt being like a gateway for a lot of these ideologies. But when I was a young man, when I was a kid, this is maybe going to be corny, but Green Day put out this album, American Idiot. And like,
of course.
To me, that was everything. And it felt so radical, and now I'm listening to like MDC,
Yeah, exactly.
But, at the time I remember like, this kind of goes into like punk as like ideology versus an aesthetic. Like I had so many friends who loved that album, but then their values didn't align with the music. Right. And it'd be like, I love punk rock music. I love the aggression. I love the eyeliner, the clothes, but yay, W, and, right. And I'm like, you guys not listening? Like I feel there's this disconnect that I think sometimes happens because when you think about punk as a sound, anyone can enjoy that. And I'm not trying to gatekeep that at all, but it's the sound as a means of the message, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah. I want to take this time to give a backhanded shout out to John Lydon. When you talk about politics not aligning with the sound or the aesthetic of punk, it's really sad that the man who was responsible for a lot of Nevermind the Bollocks is in the place that he is. But it's germane to this conversation that we bring him up and point out that this is not what our idea of punk should be. It shouldn't be about, like you and I, Dusty, were talking about the contrarianism of punk. Like, I think that punk as a social movement is way more important than that.
Well, we've sort of started to get into this, talking about Shonen Knife especially, but how do these artists from these past 4 episodes, Shonen Knife, Sex Pistols, Shaggs, Black Flag, reframe what punk means to us or what it looks like?
I think first we should definitely talk about the Shaggs because they are not what you would describe as punk in any sort of formal way, but spiritually, they're the exact idea of what punk means. I mean, if you take one listen to their music, it's very confounding and off-putting. And I've told many people, not just you when we were talking about the Shaggs, but a lot of people, hey, you got to listen to it like 3-4 times before you kind of get used to the musicianship. And I think that the Shaggs created something that to this day is still foreign to a lot of people who grew up on traditional pop or rock music. And that in and of itself is punk. It's the outsiders expressing themselves, and not everybody's going to understand the way you express yourself. And the Shaggs are an extreme example of that point.
Yeah, very extreme. I think that after knowing the details about the story behind the Shaggs and this album, I started to listen to the music in a different way, because I was thinking like this revolutionary sound or this type of punk attitude that I can feel when I'm listening to the Shaggs. But after knowing the details, I don't know. I started to feel like kind of sad. And that was part also to my conversation with Alice Bag, that for her, the Shaggs are punks. But at the same time, it was very hard for her to understand the music, knowing that basically those girls, they were feeling very bad during what they did.
And even with the Shaggs, like the agency for them to stop once they had the opportunity, I appreciate. Like, yeah, it's just once you know their story, it changes. First, it's like, this is kind of funny, like weird. Like, what the hell what am I listening to? And then when you hear about their dad forcing them to do this and all this stuff, it's like, oh, it adds, like we talked about, like a darkness to it. And we talked about in the episode a little bit, like in the lyrics, you can kind of feel a little bit of that rebellion, where they're like, what are parents, that song, like where, I don't know. It feels, you could feel them pushing against it. Actually, Martin and I went and saw Kathleen Hanna do a book reading last night, and she was talking about Leslie Gore, who sings "It's My Party" and "I'll Cry If I Want to." And she said that she talked about how she could feel in her voice, even like there were like older men writing these songs, but she could feel her pushing against these narratives in her voice, even not the words, but the way she sang. And that's something I feels like resonates with me and the Shaggs as well.
Totally.
Yeah, I feel as though the microphones don't lie. The microphones pick stuff up whether or not you intend for that feeling to come out. It's something I think about a lot when I listen to the Shaggs, is like you can feel that melancholy come out of their songs even when it feels unintentional.
For sure. And, Sex Pistols and Black Flag, I feel like on the face, they seem like pretty like obvious. Like they're two of the big punk bands. I don't know that I would say you would associate with punk, but I feel like they each brought something totally different to the table. And Sex Pistols kind of like, for better or for worse, set the tone of what punk was going to look like for what came after. Like, it's where people get this idea of like, oh, it's leather jackets, it's Doc Martens, it's spiky hair. Which was cool. And that was such a big part of their whole thing.
Yeah. Sex Pistols, for me, and probably for a lot of people, didn't reframe what punk means. It framed what punk means to a lot of people.
Something like that is important, at least to understand the punk rock movement in Latin America, is that when Nevermind the Bollocks came out, it was like 14 countries in Latin America were under military dictatorships, right? So for Latin America, it was easier to understand The Clash than to understand Sex Pistols. Why? Because Sex Pistols had this like super strong aesthetic, and that was putting on risk, on the street, because we were under dictatorship. So it was a physical risk being a fan of Sex Pistols in Latin America. So that's why, and we can also talk about the music industry and promotion and why the Clash were more successful than the Sex Pistols. But I think that it was important to understand that context. The context in Latin America was like dictatorships. That music was like banned in the radio stations, and it was it started this like tape trading that allowed us to basically start building this movement. And in the episode of El Cancionero de Kurt, we found, the biggest punk band in Latin America called The Violadores, that were like our Sex Pistols, and for Latin America, it was like Sex Pistols. It was a kind of cult, but The Clash was like the mainstream or the more normal way to listen to punk. Again, it was a very hard context in the US as well, in Europe. We are talking about people who are literally being revolutionaries against the status quo. So just to understand or to revisit the political context where Nevermind the Bollocks came out, it was super like revealing to me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting what you bring up about how many countries in Latin America were dictatorships, because in an American frame of mind, in a United States frame of mind, it's like, okay, if you dress like the Sex Pistols, you're going to walk down the street and get beat up. But that's a completely different context than you're going to get arrested and put in prison and potentially tortured simply for the way you dress or the music you listen to.
Totally.
I was going to add that, Sex Pistols, I think, came to sort of define punk because I think they were like one of the first bands that appeared like on national television. And so for a lot of like suburban mom and dads who, weren't active in like the underground music scene, like that was their first introduction to punk. And so I feel like that's sort of how like that look and that sound kind of came to define it, because that was what television was introducing to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
That's true. Yeah.
I can remember again, going back to like high school time for me, like when emo became a thing and the news reports being like, parents be warned of this emo craze. And like, it was just so scary, and it freaked out parents. And of course, as a kid, you're like, I'm going to go to Hot Topic and dig in more and find out more about this.
Exactly.
Get a studded bracelet.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that something happened with Sex Pistols. They didn't start punk. Yes, we can all agree about that. Right. Punk didn't start just in London. And it was also part of the conversation with Alice Bag. She was like, I was already playing punk, music when this album came out. And the Ramones did it like 10 years ago, before that. And also, if we were talking about punk, we have to talk about Los Psychos in Peru, there is a big theory around that, and it was the 60s when the Psychos were literally playing punk in Peru. Nobody's going to believe that, but that is true, amigos. So, yes, I think that they are kind of pioneers of this movement, but it's interesting what had happened after, because all the pop culture around Sex Pistols that came after with the years also erased part of the history of punk. And I'm talking about Psychos or also women in punk.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to various movements all over. I mean, you could talk about the band Death in Detroit. Yeah. They played a style that was eventually transformed into punk. And I think that you bring up a great point, Albina, about how the Sex Pistols were visible, and also you, Janice, about the visibility of the Sex Pistols and the fact that they are credited with starting the punk movement because Malcolm McLaren was such a savvy promoter.
Touch on Black Flag, too. I mean, to me, I think that the Black Flag and Sex Pistols overlap, but there's almost two sides of the same coin where Black Flag and Sex Pistols both had really good branding, if I'm going to use a gross word. like the Sex Pistols had a defined aesthetic and look, the Black Flag bars, but the way they went about things is so different. They're both antagonistic, but Black Flag was so about this DIY lifestyle, about they were maniacs, frankly, like practicing for like 8 to 10 hours a day, not making any money. Like it's just to push forward this sound and ideology. And of course, with this record, My War, that we were talking about, they were even pushing against punk of what it was at that point. They defined hardcore more or less with Damaged. And then once people started doing that, they were like, yeah, we're going to slow it way down, and we love metal now, and we're growing our hair. It's the defiance against what's supposed to be the idea of defiance.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Because of that, Black Flag were ahead of the curve in terms of punk. And I associate punk with being ahead of the curve a lot of the time. I feel like it's simultaneously ahead and behind the curve, depending on your band or your frame of reference. But Black Flag has that sense of contrarianism that feels more punk than when we talk about John Lydon and the Sex Pistols. And they also had this insane work ethic, as you're pointing out, Dusty. And not only did they practice for hours and hours and hours a day, they toured constantly. They were always on the road. You know, it's not outside of the realm of imagination to hear about Black Flag doing 3-4 American tours in a single year. I mean, what band around now does that? Feel like bands tour like maybe once a year, and then they are praised for their work ethic.
Bueno, is that the DIY style versus what the music industry says that you have to do if you're an artist? And right now you go to, I will mention like 3 countries, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, who have the strongest hardcore and punk scenes in Latin America. You can go to any rock and punk show and you're going to find a Black Flag t-shirt for sure. And that is happening right now in 2024. And that represent this underground music scene in Latin America. And I think that they didn't tour too much around Latin America, but they did in like last year, like 2 years ago, like a big tour around Latin America for the first time. And it was like almost sold out. And that was incredible. And I think that Black Flag, I was talking with Susie Exposito, a great music journalist. And
Shout out to Susie, for sure.
Shout out. And she was telling me that, she became a punk because she was like watching MTV, for sure. We're all the same generation. And she played with her band a show in Brooklyn with Kim Gordon and another bands, and they arrive in a limousine. So that was so crazy for her that she decided to play the song My War by Black Flag. And she said that was super feminista to me to play exactly that song for the show. And it's, it's what Black Flag means, it's como represents that work ethic and this DIY style that is still super important and relevant now in 2024.
I think while we're talking about the aesthetic versus the ethos of punk, we should definitely bring Shonen Knife back into the conversation and frame it in a wider view as far as them being introduced to the American music scene by K Records. I mean, founder of K Records, Calvin Johnson, has always identified as a punk. His band Beat Happening. There have been arguments for the past 40 years now about whether or not Beat Happening is a punk band. And I have personally always been on the side saying, yeah, Beat Happening is a punk band. Beat Happening is one of my favorite punk bands of all time. And it's because they were staunchly anti-corporate. They did everything themselves. They recorded themselves mostly. They booked their own tours. Calvin arguably cultivated an entire national music scene from his college dorm, his apartment bedroom, from a synagogue. He moved into a synagogue in Olympia. Like, punk is not just what we're saying as, leather jackets and loud guitars. It is the idea of doing it yourself, whatever it is, doing it yourself is punk.
Totally. And I know so many people that wear leather jackets and are like right-wing supporters.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that, there's also evolution, because to me at the beginning, the sound was the most important part. But to me right now is a total different thing. To me, punk is like how you think about the music industry, how you work with your band, with your community, all the things that are beyond music. That to me is the meaning of punk right now.
I might be wrong, but I want to say that the original URL for K Records was kpunk.com, not krecords.com. I know, but yeah, it kind of goes back to what, we were talking about earlier, where it's like, punk is, an attitude of going against the norm. And, I think that anytime that you defy an expectation, it's sort of that punk attitude. And I think, there's an expectation for, music to sort of, especially I think during like the 80s and 90s, well, the 80s especially, you had like metal was dominating the charts. And you had that sort of like Eddie Van Halen, like playing guitar really fast, like, I'm not even going to mimic it because you know what I mean. That's sort of like, But, and then I feel like, then you had these bands that were like, okay, I only know 3 chords, but I'm still going to, release an album. And I feel like that's that sort of like defiant punk attitude of, and I think K Records was a lot of that, where it was like, like, okay, this might not be like technically proficient, but I need to express myself. I have something to say. And I think that releasing that music and putting it out there, that sort of bravery, I think that's really punk.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%, Janice. And I cannot wait to talk about Beat Happening in this next roundtable.
Seriously.
But while we're still on this one, how do we think punk has evolved differently around the world? And what shared experiences through punk do we all see, whether it's individually or collectively?
I was thinking about what Albina was saying earlier about how punk is community. And I think about like Dusty mentioned, like the punk houses, the sort of like social justice sort of like collaborating and gathering that has come out of punk scenes. Like in Seattle, after the horrible death of Mia Zapata of the Gits, there was that organization Home Alive that came out of it, which was to, train women how to defend yourself, like self-defense techniques. And then that became like, a nationwide organization. So I kind of, when I see a lot of like, political sort of like movements and, organizing, like, I think that to me is sort of like this contemporary voice of punk.
Totally. Mm-hmm. I think that punk became this social justice umbrella, where it's not only about music, but at the same time, you have another kind of punk movement that is more about aesthetic and it's more about music industry, and doesn't care about music or values, I think. But yes, I totally agree of what you're saying, Janice. I think that we have, specifically in the feminist movement, punk is a thing that is super important and is a super strong tool, not only to play music and to feel a musical connection. It's about the community, is about, we have to say, like for the LGBT community, punk movement is crucial, is super important for feminismo también. So I can see this like two things, like punk becoming now this like umbrella, this home for many of us beyond music. But at the same time, I can see, another movement around punk that doesn't care about values or music or anything like that.
And I would say that for many of us, at least on the side of punk being a culture and a social justice movement, punk gave us a frame of reference to learn how to organize.
Totally.
Absolutely. And you know, for me too, is also punk, like we referenced earlier, punk is how I learned about a lot about the world. Like I learned to learn different perspectives that, you know, you weren't going to get, certainly maybe not on the news or even mainstream music. It was how you learned about what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in the UK. Like I'm so in my own little bubble here, and you're just listening to a CD or whatever, a record, and just, wow, there's so much I don't know, and I need to dig further. And there's causes, but yeah, and the organization aspect of it too. Like, you know, look at today, like all these bands were doing benefits for like Gaza and things, and people are really like putting their music and their art and aligning it with their values, and that and using that value to extend to outreach across the globe is just super inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's big. I remember not long ago seeing like an article, was like Vogue or something, and it was like Travis Barker and Khloe Kardashian, or one of the Kardashians, it's like defining the punk look. And I'm just like, what? Like Travis Barker, the godfather of punk. Like I grew up on Blink-182. I'm not gonna like front,
too.
but like that's just purely untrue.
I do think it's important to talk about that. Punk has been commodified and punk has been brought into a corporate sphere, and now we are seeing things like Travis Barker and Khloe Kardashian. I believe it was Khloe. What's the other sister? Courtney?
Courtney.
It was was it Courtney? Yeah. And like,
we don't keep up with the Kardashians.
Sorry, guys. Yeah.
but yeah, like the idea of corporations buying into the punk aesthetic, not even the punk ideal, because punk's ideal is essentially anti-corporate, anti-establishment, but they somehow tapped into the aesthetic of punk and threw a bunch of money at people willing to put on the leather jacket and spike their hair and do the little dance for the world to see. And now we have this situation where every other aspect of living in the world today, where corporations have tapped into a social movement, basically. Now it's not weird to see people in corporate offices rocking tattoos or even having green hair. I remember a decade ago when I worked at a supermarket, people weren't allowed to have any other color than their natural color or a natural color of hair. But now you go into the grocery store and you see someone with pink hair and it's all good. Like, I think that is part and parcel to the idea of corporations co-opting punk. Them saying, we will allow this, which is antithetical to the entire idea of punk.
That happened with Nirvana as well.
Oh,
It's when the revolution becomes a part of the pop culture as well, you know? And I think that happened. We can see people with a t-shirt of Nirvana and they don't know who are they in Nirvana. They never listen to their music, but it's cool.
Right. I read an article about that where like people asked teenagers wearing Nirvana t-shirts, like, so what is Nirvana? They thought it was like a brand, like Stussy or something. I know.
Yeah, I remember a generation ago where that happened with the Ramones logo, where people were wearing Ramone shirts and didn't know who Johnny Ramone was. Punk has been commodified from the beginning, and it's a sad fact about the world that when an idea or a movement catches on, somebody's going to commodify it. I mean, that's the very basis of free market capitalism. All right. Well, now that we've brought the mood down to dystopian, is there anything?
As a true punk would.
I have a question. I don't know if this happened only in Latin America or also here. I remember when I was a teenager, I found punk in my life. I remember that it was like a kind of beef between the fans of the Ramones and Sex Pistols and the fans of the Rolling Stones. I don't know if you had that, but I remember that we were like super different teams. I was like, so you like the Rolling Stones? You cannot be part of my team. I don't know. It was super crazy. We call punks and Rollingas. Rollingas are the fans of Rolling Stones in Argentina. So it was a big thing when you were, a teenager. But I don't know if that happened with you guys.
I think in America, there was an understanding that the Rolling Stones, who co-opted the aesthetic from Howlin' Wolf and Bo Diddley and Willie Dixon, that punk was a natural progression from what the Rolling Stones were doing. I think it's more the beef between punks and other rockers were more like the hair metal kids or like the Ted Nugent fans or whoever. It was like traditional rock music as it were perceived around the time that punk was coming up, because as we know, traditional rock music is based in black music, but that's a different conversation for a different time. The traditional rockers of the day are the people who clashed with the punks because it was really a conservative movement. And so when you have these, wild punks, and we're talking from Black Flag to the Sex Pistols to MDC, whatever punks were out there were having to fist fight these guys, these beer drinking 70s rock guys, and they more often than not were guys. I think that's the basis of the beef in America.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, and I feel like there's an element too of like.
Sorry, God. That was outside.
No, that's pretty punk.
That was cool.
I got my Hell's Angels meeting right after this. I gotta go. What I was thinking about too when you were saying that, Albina, I can recall like a battle of like authenticity and like thinking back like emo again for me, like, a pretentious little high schooler like, oh, you like Hawthorne Heights, Taking Back Sunday. I like Sunny Day Real Estate. Rites of Spring, true emo.
The real emo.
Which is like, shut up, dude. But like, I think there's all this conversation, especially when you think about punk versus like rock, classic rock of like, this music stands for something. That stuff's all about like partying and whatever. Like, I don't know. I think there's this, those are the conversations I can recall, like getting into debates with friends and things. Well, also like Kurt, Aerosmith is on his list. He loved, whoa.
What's going on?
What is?
Is it here?
I was like,
a drill.
this time it's
Yeah, it
not
sounds
here.
like somebody's drilling. Okay,
Oh,
I
no.
think I think we're good now, but that was pretty weird.
The universe is telling us to wrap it up, I think.
Yeah, Barry was like, y'all need to
Knock it up.
disperse.
I think that Roddy was who sent that sign. It's like, chicos,
In conclusion, I think punk is the friends we made along the way. I think we can all agree.
Thank you to Janice Headley and Albina Cabrera for joining us today. Thank you to Larry Mizell Jr., our boss and our editorial director, for his episode on Black Flag's My War. Go listen to El Cancinero de Kurt, hosted by our very own Albina Cabrera. Or you can watch it on YouTube with English subtitles like I do, because I haven't, I'm only in the Pearl League of Duolingo.
I love that, Martin. I love you.
And special shout out to Janice Headley as well for hosting our new podcast series in our headphones. Isabel Khalili is our podcast manager. Shout out to her. Shout out to Roddy, who is listening in on our conversation and editing and engineering, doing his audio production thing. I just rambled that whole list of credits off. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP.
What happened last night?
Not bad at all. We went to, it was crazy. We went to a book reading. Wild. Sorry, I just brain farting. Man, I drank a coffee last night and I couldn't sleep till like 3 or 4 a.m. So I'm like dying.
That's why I didn't have coffee at town hall. Yeah. I can't have coffee after 2 p.m. Otherwise, I'm up all night.
Yeah. That's super punk, Martin.